Thank you for joining us here for this conference in Montreal. It's a very exciting agenda, but I think govern or be governed is quite a punchy theme for the conference. And as the commissioner set out in his remarks, we've gone through a period in the last decade of trying to frame regulation to regulate digital spaces, to try and understand what those accountabilities and liabilities of the tech companies should be. This is a process you've all been involved with, Jeremy and Alexandra as legislators, and Jeremy in government. Sasha, your work at the ISD was really hugely important throughout that process and since in identifying the harms and the risks. To what extent do you think we have succeeded so far? To what extent do you think the regimes in Europe, from the UK to the EU, have met the challenge that we face, both in terms of keeping people safe online, but also protecting the resilience of democracy? Right, Sasha, would you like to start us off?
Thank you so much, Damian. I mean, as you said, my team at ISD has been analysing, sort of detecting the threat landscape, threats from hostile state actors, from the Kremlin to Iran, to the CCP, monitoring online activities of terrorist and violent extremist groups, the weaponization of hate, targeted hate, that can lead to violence in the real world. And for a long time, we understood that the platforms were failing to enforce their own rules in relation to these types of threats. The safety of our kids, same thing, failures all round to enforce their own rules. But what we found over time was that it wasn't just that they were failing to do what they said that they would do in relation to those problems. To add insult to injury, they were in fact systematically amplifying the kinds of content, the kinds of activities that came closest to the red line in terms of what was permissible legally and what was permissible by their own terms of service. And that inorganic amplification of the stuff that comes closest to the red line is an enormous skewing of the information ecosystem. We started to understand that, in fact, these were not free speech environments. These were environments where the platforms essentially decide what you see, what you don't see. And the kind of divisions that we've seen escalate across societies globally have a lot to do with this set of problems. On top of which, they started to progressively shutter the kind of access to data required for third-party independent research to be able to do that detection and monitoring of those types of threats, to try to keep people safe, to try to keep democracy safe from these types of attacks from outside and from within. And we realized that actually the voluntary commitments that were often talked about were not being met. We have made real progress, I believe, in a number of different geographic contexts, at the EU level, in the UK, in Australia, towards establishing what I see as speech protective rules, the heart of which is really transparency. And we heard a little bit about this. It is in absolutely everybody's interests, whether you are worried that the platforms are systemically biased against right-wing or left-wing views, or indeed any views. It is in your interest to make sure that there is an ecosystem of scrutiny, that there is data accessible to independent researchers to be able to evidence whether in fact these algorithmic systems are doing that or not. We have started to see progress in that direction, certainly with Article 40 of the DSA. That takes us in that direction. And at the same time, there are protections for speech. First time ever we have a kind of due process, if in fact you have been removed unfairly, if you feel that you have been censored, there is a process now in place where you can complain, and there has been actually real progress on redress. 30% of those complaints have in fact been put back.
If you go back to the world before the DSA, before the Online Safety Act in the UK, what we had was self-reporting for the companies that was seen as very inadequate. Thinking of things like NetzDG in Germany being an example of that. The challenge from external research from organizations like ISD that was highlighting the problems. On the whole, the platforms downplayed and were in denial about. So we decided there had to be legislation to create those liabilities. I mean, you've been involved in this process for years in the European Parliament. Are you happy with where we ended up in terms of the legislation that was created? Do you think it is being enforced in the way you would have liked?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question. I'm happy with the legislation we created. I mean, no legislation is perfect, but I think the Digital Services Act is really an excellent start to tackle not single posts, what individual users do, but really the systemic risk, the systemic skewing of the information ecosystem that these companies bring about. So I think it's a good piece of legislation. I'm extremely disappointed that it is not being enforced sufficiently. This is what we are seeing. There is some enforcement in areas where the European Commission and European member states governments think there might be similar thinking on the other side of the Atlantic. For example, child protection and minors protection, which is extremely important, but which is already in the DSA. I mean, there's already an article in the DSA that says if there's systemic risk for the protection of minors, the platforms have to take mitigating measures, and if they don't, they're in breach of the DSA. And the European Commission can put sanctions on them. So why aren't we just using the legislation we have rather than thinking for years about how to come up with something new? And that is particularly true as far as the risks for democracy are concerned. My impression is that the information ecosystem is even more skewed than before. It's even harder to find normal content that's not extremist, that's not hateful, that is not violent, that is not close to the red line, the borderline, as Sasha explained right now. People are being flooded by this. There are so many studies that show if you register, for example, a TikTok account and you follow 4 major parties in my country, for example, in Germany, 80% of the content that ends up in your timeline is from the far-right party that is deemed anti-constitutional by our courts. And similar studies we have for all major European countries. There's a study that shows how in the German federal elections, on X, the far-right party was amplified by 3 times. A pro-Putin party was amplified by 10 times, while the moderate progressive parties, the Social Democrats, were reduced to a 12th of the amount of tweets they wrote, and the Greens, my party, to a 5th. So if you look at, basically reducing to a 12th one party and triplicating or another one, the far-right one, what kind of content are you going to see? And what is the agenda setting that happens then for mainstream politics, for the media, and so on? And all these systemic risks, they're under investigations ongoing, but we don't see any progress. We don't see any outcomes. We don't see anything changing. So we have the legislation, but the situation is getting worse and worse. And with generative AI, we know how the internet is being flooded by propaganda, by disinformation, by deepfakes of all kinds, particularly harassing women in a horrible way. And what we hear is that the fear of the US government is really great. This intimidation effort that the US government has started even before Trump was in power. September 2024, J.D. Vance said, if Europe wants to enforce the DSA, we will consider pulling our troops out of NATO. So we have these 2 threats at the same time. On the one hand, the tariffs, and on the other hand, the positioning of the US government around Ukraine, which is not important only for Ukraine, and I really stand by Ukraine very clearly. But the Russian threat for Europeans, that is a very concrete military threat. My capital, Berlin, is not very far from the Russian border. There's just Poland in between. So that is a really crucial threat we feel. And my feeling is that the European Commission is saying, yes, we stand by our legislation, but it's not significantly, meaningfully enforcing it, because we could change all this to save democracy. And it's not enough to do something for minors. If you don't correct this information ecosystem and make sure that everybody has freedom of speech, that all opinions are heard, that all political opinions are heard, and that people can really make a free choice, we are losing this battle anyway.
Yeah, I mean, Jeremy, just slightly responding to, I was going to ask you about the UK legislation, but I think slightly responding as well to what Alexandra has just said. Firstly, are you content with the way in which legislation like the Online Safety Act, the Digital Markets Competition and Consumers Act have been enforced by the government? Is it what you expected when you were Secretary of State really at the very start of these processes? Also, the UK has gone through now 2 rounds of trade negotiations with the American government, with the Trump administration. What is your concern about the impact that the rhetoric of Trump and of JD Vance is having on UK policy?
Yes, so I think the answer to the first question is no, I'm not entirely satisfied. I think, though, you probably have to say, and there are 2 practicing politicians, 1 recovering politician up here, and you've heard from another practicing politician already, I'm sure we would all say passing legislation is not an art. You have to be practical, you have to give ground, you have to make compromises. So every piece of legislation we pass is not exactly what we had in mind.
It was like a Jackson Pollock painting, maybe, lots of stuff poured.
I'm hoping not quite like that. Not quite like that. But it definitely wasn't a work of art.
Yeah.
So I think you have to be practical about the process of passing legislation. So I suppose I was never going to be entirely satisfied. But I completely agree with what Alexandra says about enforcement. However good the legislation, the reality is that what we are tending to do now as politicians in the UK and elsewhere is passing what we describe as framework legislation. It sets out the broad parameters of what we want, the principles we want to apply. We leave an awful lot of work to the regulators. And so the component in this we can't forget is what the regulator does with the legislation we hand over to them. And I have my disagreements with the regulators in the UK about how they've interpreted the legislation that we have handed over, but it's an important component in the activity here. On the US and its influence, look, there is no doubt that what Donald Trump and his administration say have huge reverberations across the world. I would gently observe that what the Trump administration says and what the Trump administration does are not always identical. But nonetheless, it is true that whatever the Trump administration says it's going to do has an impact. But I think what we must be careful not to do is to deny ourselves as politicians in other countries and in the US agency here. We still do have power to act, and we should take that responsibility seriously. And although I completely concede that the Online Safety Act, and I'm sure others would say the same for their own domestic legislation, is not quite as good as we'd like it to be, perhaps not quite enforced as rigorously as we'd like it to be, let us recognize, as Sasha says, that we have made progress here. And what that should tell us is not that the work is done, it clearly isn't, but that more progress is possible. And I think politicians have to take responsibility now for doing more, not just to make sure that the legislation they've already passed is enforced, but making sure that when they pass future legislation, how implementable it is, how practically deliverable it is, matters much, much more than the good headlines you can get on the day you pass the legislation. That's what we all have to remember.
It seems, though, I think, like we've entered a new phase where at the start it was, the tech company's view was, the problems aren't as big as you think they are, and we've got them under control, to and then a next phase which was, the problems might be as big as you think they are, but we're better placed to manage them than you, so therefore don't regulate us, to then, well, if you pass these laws, we'll abide by them. We now seem to be in an active phase where they're pushing back and saying these rules shouldn't exist at all. We want them, we're either not going to enforce them, or we don't expect to be fined and punished as a consequence of that there's an active pushback supported by the president.
I think that's true, but there's some opportunism here, and your last point must be the relevant one, that in the end, none of these platforms want to be regulated. What business, what industry does? They all believe if they were left alone, they'd be better off. And I accept that that's going to be what everybody says. It can't be what we as governments respond to favorably. We have to say that in the end, it is not possible for self-regulation to be successful in lots of different areas. That's not just a matter of self-interest, it's a matter of perspective. It's very difficult for anyone developing these ideas to pull back far enough to see their broader implications. Sasha's completely right. There's more than that going on here. There's plenty of malign intent too. But I do think that we have to be cautious about saying as legislators that there is no more we can do here. They're always going to be misbehaving. It is our responsibility as legislators, as governments, to constrain this kind of activity. And I think that's the responsibility we're all going to have to work on.
I mean, the commissioner used, in his remarks, he used the expression that platforms promote polarization. something which our former parliamentary colleague Nick Clegg disagrees with, but I think Nick is wrong on that. And the platforms say it's not in their interest to create bad outcomes for people, but I think they've demonstrated that their business interests can be satisfied whether the outcomes are good or bad. But inherent in what the Commissioner talked about, Democracy Shield, you have a shield to protect yourself from a known threat, and I mean, Sasha, your work at ISD has looked at those information threats that affect democracy. We've always seen those as, in the past, when we sort of started this journey in sort of 2016, 17, looking at Russian interference in democracy and politics, some of those threats seem to be internal from populist political movements. I mean, what do you think the threat level is now? What should we be most worried about?
I mean, I think it's important to remember, because often these conversations are framed as conversations about different forms of speech, that information operations driven by hostile state actors are in fact extensions of their military defense capabilities and operations. And it is ludicrous not to respond to what is a very, very well evident set of tactics, evolving set of tactics now, increasingly AI empowered set of tactics. And what we've seen with foreign interference is that the best way to do that is for a blurring of the lines between what is ostensibly foreign and what is domestic. And we've seen for a very long time now a sort of interaction, a mutual reinforcement between hostile state and domestic extremist and other types of conspiracist networks in the promotion of certain types of objectives, sometimes political objectives around elections, but not only. And I think it's important to understand that these are tactics for deception. They're very clearly deceptive mechanisms. It's not just about the contents, it's about the ways in which they exploit the online ecosystem for deception. Again, being able to detect and respond to that is really important. You can't do that if the platforms are shuttering access to the kind of data needed to do that, and then failing often to catch it themselves, even though they say that they will. But I think it's also really important to understand that the threat landscape is constantly evolving. And I think it's really important to understand that we are only at the outset now of regulatory enforcement. These laws came into place very recently. The infrastructure to put them into practice is just still getting up and running. And so we really do need to see them through. Otherwise, we haven't really even tried it. And I think that there are principles, mechanisms there that could do a great deal. We will then understand where the gaps are. There will be gaps. Nothing is perfect. But we do need to take this very seriously. And democracy, I think what authoritarian states and authoritarians writ large have understood is that the battle between democracy, liberal democracy, and authoritarianism is taking place in the shaping of the information ecosystem today. And I think what Democrats, small d Democrats, have failed to understand is how central that is.
Yeah. I mean, Alexandra, do you think, I mean, the theme for our panel is weaponization of tech governance. I mean, do you think the Trump administration is weaponizing tech governance in its negotiations with the European Union, and particularly over trade policy? Do you have a concern as well about you mentioned J.D. Vance earlier, the overt support of people in the MAGA movement and in the tech community in America for AfD in Germany? Do you see that as a form of foreign interference, but rather coming from Russia, it's coming from across the Atlantic?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. That is exactly what is happening. And I would say a third point is the creation of narratives, which seem to be floating around, but they are created at a table at a certain point. For example, the freedom of speech argument against the DSA, calling the DSA the Digital Censorship Act. And this is exactly what happens in that kind of information ecosystems. This is how our brain works. If you keep repeating a thing, at a certain point, it becomes like a fact, and you can't distinguish it because, the DSA is a very complicated, complex piece of legislation, and not very many people have read it. So if people keep hearing this is something has to do with censorship, I wrote a piece the other day on the DSA as being, an instrument of freedom of speech because of some of the things that the commissioners mentioned. And then I ran it through an artificial intelligence tool to correct the English, and it changed it. And it said, oh, there are issues around speech because of the DSA, rather than saying, and this is how you see, how all this content on the net then gets into these instruments, and then you don't get it out because everybody uses them for writing, so who's not well informed. So what we're seeing right now is really a very deliberate attack with these narratives. And these narratives are created, for example, by a congressman named Jim Jordan, who uses a congressional committee to subpoena organizations, for example, to spread these narratives. He comes to Brussels and he teaches exactly the same method they used to take down the electoral partnership at Stanford, who investigated foreign disinformation again in the US. So Russian disinformation, Iranian disinformation, Chinese disinformation. In whose interest is it to stop the fight against foreign disinformation in the US? And exactly the same people are now coming to Brussels to teach the far right in Brussels how to use exactly the same techniques, what kind of speaking points to make. And they make them in every committee. So there's no real distinction anymore between what is MAGA, what is Putin, what are far right homegrown parties. They all work together and they teach each other what are the good narratives, what are the techniques, how do I plant this? And we know how much money is behind there. This is not easy because of the rhythm, the amount of repetitions and where you keep reading it. This is how to counter. So this is a story we definitely need to tell. And I would like to go back one question to you asked before. What has changed? I think what has changed for the companies is that before there was some kind of agreement that, yeah, there were harms. The disagreement was on how to address them and how much should governments and legislators step in. Now they're basically saying, no, there are no harms. The only harm is the regulation. The internet is perfectly fine. And the US government is stating almost openly, writing posts on Substack, that they want civilizational allies in Europe. They want regime change in Europe. They want to bring certain parties into power. And one of the cases is the case of Elon Musk and J.D. Vance supporting AfD in my country. Let's see what's going to happen in France when there will be elections, but we have heard rumors that the State Department is considering using funds it used to use for democracy promotion to support the far-right candidate. And they know very well that social media are their way to do that, because once you have this skewed information ecosystem, it's always the far-right who's going to win. It's always the extremist parties who are going to win. And this is why they are attacking the Digital Services Act so much. And this is why Europe needs to wake up, and especially the centrist parties right now in power, because they are the people who will be gone together with our democracy. And this is why it's so important that we step in here and defend this legislation and meaningfully enforce it.
I mean, Jeremy, how do you see those issues?
Yeah, I very much agree. And I think actually there are several different things going on here at once. The first thing maybe to say is that I don't think these arguments about the appropriate delineation between acceptable free speech and unacceptable free speech is a new argument. We're just having it in a new context. So we have always, as politicians, had to work out what's acceptable and what isn't. And all that I think we're talking about here is attempting to level the playing field so that those rules and principles are applied online as they're applied everywhere else. But I also think the point about defense of democracy is really important, because whether there's a conspiracy or not, several things are coming together here that present collectively a real threat to the way in which we preserve our democracies. It is true that if you communicate through these sorts of digital means, the format, the way in which you present your argument tends to drag people towards simplistic statements rather than nuanced ones. And of course, you can get more play, you can get more reach for extreme views rather than moderate views. That is undoubtedly a factor. But in addition to that, I think that we as politicians, as political classes across all the different countries that we are interested in, have become confident, complacent even, in the notion that democracy is impregnable, that democracy will always be there. And it's only about arguing for your little piece of it, for your particular tribe within the political structure. And I don't believe that's necessarily true anymore. which means that we all have to take a little bit more responsibility as politicians for the way in which we express ourselves and not fall victim to the temptation to attack the structures of our politics, attack the underpinnings of our democracy, not to say elections have been stolen when they clearly haven't, not to attack the confines on politicians provided by the judiciary and other checks and balances, because all we're doing is undermining the foundations of our democracy and making it easier for the malign forces that both of the other speakers have mentioned to do their work.
Just briefly on that point, do you think Elon Musk should have been charged with incitement for what he said in London a few weeks ago?
Well, as you know,
obviously it wasn't physically in London,
yeah,
but what he said.
I've been a criminal lawyer, prosecuted cases, and I was the Attorney General for a while, supervising our prosecuting authorities. So you're not going to get me to comment on whether a criminal offence was committed there or not. but I will say that although I do think the preeminent responsibility here is on politicians, those who put themselves up for a political office, those who are political players, and undoubtedly Elon Musk is one of those, bear that responsibility as well. Now, some of those people don't want democracy to thrive, but quite a lot of them do want democracy to thrive, but don't think that what they're doing will erode the underpinnings of democracy as much as I think it will. So we, I think, collectively as politicians have to start speaking up more for the ways in which we responsibly communicate our political messages without undermining the foundations of our democracies.
Yeah, but I think it's we won't go down that rabbit hole, but it's a kind of it is a fine line to say, well, I can say what I like because I'm a political activist, as part of democracy, versus actually what you are through pretending to be a politician, you were also inciting violent acts and eroding democracy as well.
Completely, and one of the reasons we're talking here about regulating the online space is that we're regulating it for everybody, and we're doing it because free speech, like every other rights question, is about a balance of rights. Your freedom of speech might inhibit other people's freedom of speech. Somebody has to arbitrate in those disputes, and we've got to create structures for that to happen in exactly the same ways in every other environment.
Yeah, I mean, very briefly as well, if I may, one more round, the theme I want to explore before we run out of time. I've spoken to a lot of researchers, Sasha, in the last 6 months or so, university academics, think tanks, campaign organizations, who feel a massive weight of pressure at the moment that they are engaged in work which is deemed unhelpful by political figures in America in particular, particularly if their funding is based there. Do you recognize those concerns?
Absolutely, and I think that set of challenges to the research sector, to independent, to academic institutions, to the civic sector, to NGOs, is very, very real. I think wherever we see a sort of persecution of the civic sector, we know that it is, of course, a sign of democratic backslide. Having worked in authoritarian environments around the world, we know this. I've seen it, very much up close and personally. This has to be resisted. And I think the challenge now is that the language of liberalism is being applied to essentially achieve illiberal ends. And I think one of the challenges in protecting now the sector is in fact that we do need to be very clear in our framing of what it is that we do in terms of platform accountability, how in fact it is about creating a free marketplace of ideas for the real free competition of ideas and speech.
Yeah.
And what we don't have right now is a free marketplace of ideas and speech. It is in fact distorted. And you have this sort of funhouse mirror of the most extreme, the most sensationalist, sometimes the most dangerous activity, essentially taking precedence over everything else. And we do need to be able to frame this conversation in relation to upholding freedoms in order to be able to protect the types of organizations independently that are looking at these phenomena online. And of course, governments, everybody should be concerned. But it is certainly a campaign, a political campaign that we've seen for very specific purposes, waged against the civic sector. We have seen, with great effect in America, but it is coming across the pond.
Yeah. I mean, Alexandra, in terms of what comes next, obviously everyone talks about AI regulation, which has been a very difficult area so far for governments. Although in some ways, both the DSA and the Online Safety Act they are pieces of AI regulation already, because I always think what they're principally regulating is feeds, which is a piece of AI. But the impact of AI, particularly on the information space, could make a lot of these problems a lot worse. Do you think that is something that we have got a good approach on yet? Is that an area? Is that a gap, do you think, in our regulatory armory?
I think it's a gap. I don't think the AI Act is enough. And the pushback on the AI Act is also very, very strong. I think we have a gap. I think we did not foresee, when we worked on the AI Act, we didn't have generative AI yet. It came in while we were in the process, but at a very late stage. So we tried as Parliament to accommodate, asking for some transparency, at least in terms of what kind of sources do you use, or what kind of material you use to train the algorithms and so on. But it didn't really make it very comprehensively to the last version of the law. So I think we absolutely do have a gap there. And I think the problem, this is not only about platforms. This is a comprehensive attack on our democracy, but also on our economy. But because if you look what especially OpenAI is doing, but also the other ones, they want to build an empire. They want to embed everything in that AI system. If anybody in the room hasn't read Karen Ho's Empire of AI, read it. It's really a great read. So I think the message we need to communicate, this is against our democracy. This is against our economy. We will still have an economy, but it will be a colonial economy. It will not be the economy where we are leading by technological leadership, which is something we in Europe were used to have, which UK was used to have. As Western countries, this is not what's going to happen anymore. And I don't think we are at all prepared to these companies putting people out of their jobs, basically, because what we have now in terms of productivity gains is artists not working anymore, computer programmers not finding jobs, first generation, not finding jobs anymore, translators, interpreters, and who knows what the next category is going to be. But it's not the hard, dirty work which was promised to be done. We still, cleaning, in terms of cleaning, AI is still not great, but in terms of putting decently paid people out of the jobs, and these companies are not paying taxes in Europe, basically. They're paying less than half of what European companies are paying. So it's a lot more comprehensive. The whole question is, are we still going to have free media in 2 years from now? Now with Google AI and overview mode, so people don't click through the websites anymore. The whole funding and business model of the free press is completely collapsing. So I think the issues are much bigger. And what at least we could start to do is enforce the legislation we have and build our own digital infrastructure, build our own systems. In order to do that, to have the necessary momentum, it's important that countries like the European Union, like Canada, like Australia, like Taiwan, team up and do this together, because nobody of us wants to be blackmailed by the US.
Yeah.
Alexandra missed out the UK and her coalition.
Yeah. Well, that's... But, and that's not, I hasten to add, because the UK is perfect. But look, I think. Well, no, I can't.
Our AI Act, the AI bill. It seems to have evaporated.
Completely evaporated. But I think to some extent that's because of what you said. That there is a school of thought that says AI can be dealt with under the existing structures, and we only have to extrapolate from what we already have. To some extent, I've got sympathy with that, but I think we will probably need to get to a point where we have something specific. And the reason that I think that is the reason that in the EU we didn't eventually complete the process of the AI liability directive. So the issue of what happens if you set up AI and it does something bad, what happens to you as a human being, as a corporate entity, we have not yet resolved. That we must, because without that component, I don't think any structure will be complete. But look, if you take for an example the issue of disinformation, which we've talked a bit about because it is so fundamental to this threat to democracy we're describing. That is only going to get worse as a result of AI intervention. But that doesn't mean we are powerless to act or that we can't do something about it. And thinking about ways in which people can identify material that is AI generated, equally how people can identify material that has been changed, the watermarking, the provenance questions that we can think about, all of that matters. But actually for me, what matters more than any of that is giving our kids, and indeed our adults, the equipment they need to be skeptical about what they see, online and elsewhere, but online in particular. They're already skeptical about what I say, I'm sure about what Alexandra says, too. That's not a problem, but why aren't we being skeptical about whatever else we see? That's at the heart of our defenses against all of these threats.
Thank you very much. We're just on time. I was going to ask whether we should be worried about the role of cryptocurrency in paying for all of this, another deregulated area, but we may have to deal with that over coffee, or people may have to ask you later on about that. But Sasha, Alexandra, Jeremy, thank you so much for your remarks.
Thank you.